Dust coiled in the wind, like smoke from a dying fire. Dry Creek sat still beneath the sweltering eye of a late summer sun, every board on every porch groaning under the weight of heat and silence. The town hadn't seen real rain in 6 months, and even the wind felt brittle, like it might snap if it moved too fast. Horses swatted at flies with listless tails, and somewhere in the hills a hawk cried once, then was swallowed by the yawning sky. Ellis rode into town like a shadow that had lost its light. No one ever heard his horse coming, just looked up and found him already there, tall in the saddle, black hat pulled low, dust caked in the creases of his long coat. He never spoke, never tied his horse to the rail like others did. He simply dismounted, walked where he needed, and left again with the same quiet weight that unsettled everyone who watched him. Children stopped playing when they saw him. Old men fell silent on their benches. Women crossed to the other side of the street, not out of fear. There was no malice in Ellis, but out of reverence, maybe, or something that smelled like guilt. No one really knew what he had done or who he had been, but they told stories in hushed voices when the saloon ran quiet. Some said he once led a posse into Comanche territory and came back the only one breathing. Others claimed he'd ridden with the Texas Rangers until he put a bullet through his own captain for leaving innocence behind. A few whispered he hadn't spoken a word since the day he buried a wife and child under an oak tree somewhere west of El Paso. Whatever truth there was lived behind his eyes, and no one had ever dared look too long. That morning, Ellis stopped outside the general store. He stepped down, boots hitting the earth with the heavy certainty of a man who expected nothing and feared even less. He nodded once at old Tom Grilly behind the counter, who returned the gesture without a word, sliding a bag of coffee and a tin of tobacco across the worn counter. Money exchanged hands. No one said thank you. The silence cracked an hour later, just as the sun hit its cruelest peak. They came riding hard and loud, a dirty wind of hooves and laughter. The Cutter boys. 6 of them at first, maybe 7. It was hard to count with the way dust followed them like a funeral shroud. At their head rode Brig Cutter, a man with a gold tooth, a red duster, and the swagger of someone who had never been hit hard enough to make him humble. He pulled his horse to a stop in the middle of Dry Creek's one and only street and leaned back in the saddle like he owned the land beneath him. "Well, look what the buzzards haven't gotten yet," Brig called, grinning at the faces peeking through windows and around doors. Dry Creek's still breathing barely. Thought we'd find ourselves a ghost town. A few townsfolk shuffled into view. Sheriff Wilkes stood on the porch of his office, hand near his pistol, but not on it. He was a big man with a limp, and everybody knew he wasn't quick anymore, not with a gun or a decision. Brig dismounted with a theatrical groan, cracked his neck, and walked toward the sheriff with the lazy confidence of a man who expected no resistance. "We're looking for hospitality," he said, "and donations." "You'll get nothing but cold stares," Wilkes replied, voice gravelly but steady. Brig smiled wider. "Ain't that enough to earn a punch in the mouth?" Tension snapped taut, like a stretched rope. One of Brig's boys chuckled. Another spit on the ground. Wilkes didn't flinch, but he didn't draw either. Then came the sound, soft at first, of hooves on dirt. Ellis. He rode past the square slow, without a word, heading toward the trail back to his ranch. The Cutter boys turned as he passed. One of them pointed. "Who the hell's that scarecrow?" "That," said Brig, sneering, "is the famous silent rancher. Heard he don't talk, don't blink, and don't bleed. Just ghosts around town like a spook." "He deaf?" "No, just dead inside." They laughed loud and mean. One of them made a mock bow in Ellis's direction. "Hey, ghost man, you forget your voice in the war." Ellis didn't stop, didn't even look. He rode past them like they were fence posts, just more scenery between him and the horizon. Brig called after him. "Where you going, huh? Hide up on your hill again, polishing your bones." No reply. No reaction. "Coward," one of the gang spat. "A man who won't speak is a man who's got nothing worth saying." The laughter echoed as Ellis turned the corner and disappeared into the red haze of the canyon road. That night, the wind came up angry. It rattled shutters and lifted skirts of dust that scurried like rats across the fields. Inside his cabin at the edge of the bluffs, Ellis lit a lantern and set it on the table beside a long, narrow bundle wrapped in oiled cloth. He poured himself a single glass of water, drank half, and sat in the silence. The room smelled of earth and pine tar, faint and old. Slowly, he unwrapped the cloth to reveal a rifle, an old Sharps, its wood aged like driftwood, the metal still dark and clean. He ran a cloth along the barrel, wiped down the stock with a reverence that bordered on sacred. He opened a small drawer and took out a photograph, creased, faded, the edges singed. A woman smiled softly in the picture, one hand resting on the shoulder of a little girl who looked to be 6, maybe 7. Both wore dresses made from calico, plain and beautiful. The girl had his eyes. Ellis stared at the photo for a long while, then tucked it into a notch he'd carved inside the rifle stock. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, the wind outside sounded like voices. Laughter, screaming, gunfire. Then it faded. Ellis rose, lifted the rifle, and set it upright in the corner. The lantern flickered once and held steady. Outside, Dry Creek slept uneasy, unaware that the wind carried more than dust now. It carried the breath of old memories waking up. The first ranch to burn was the Carter place, 3 miles south of Dry Creek. Smoke rose black and slow into the cloudless sky, twisting like a dying snake as it drifted across the canyons. By the time anyone reached it, the barn was ash. The house collapsed in on itself, and all that was left of the livestock were hoof prints and blood. No one claimed responsibility, but everyone knew who'd done it. The Cutter boys didn't ride in for justice or vengeance. They came for control. Ranch by ranch, they cut through the territory like a sickness. Cattle went missing. Wells were poisoned. Fences pulled down and burned. They left messages carved into doors or painted in pig's blood. Asterisk, we were here. Don't make us come back. Asterisk. Sheriff Wilkes tried. God help him. He tried. Rode out alone one morning to face them, where they'd holed up near the Blanco Ridge Trail, pistols on both hips and a scattergun across his saddle. He returned by dusk slumped over the horse's neck, blood pouring from his leg and his badge missing from his chest. No one asked what happened. They didn't need to. Within a week, half the town was gone. Families packed wagons under moonlight, not even bothering to say goodbye. Businesses shuttered. Schoolhouse closed. The church bell rang one last time and then went silent, rust bleeding down its side like dried tears. Ellis watched it all from the edge of town. He didn't ride out to fight. He didn't raise a hand in protest. But he showed up where he was needed, in the dark, in the dust, in the blood-soaked aftermath. He brought cloth to bind wounds, hauled water, lifted collapsed beams off men with broken ribs. Never said a word, but in every motion there was a purpose, and in every gesture, a kind of penance. That's how Clara Dade found him, or maybe how he found her. Her farm was the fourth to fall. They came at night, drunken, laughing, setting fire to the chicken coop just to watch it scream. She fired a shotgun through the window, caught one of them in the leg. They pulled her out into the yard and beat her with the stock of her own gun. Would have done worse if not for the neighbor's dog barking loud enough to wake the canyon. Ellis came at dawn. She lay against the smoldering ruin of her porch, lips split, one eye swollen shut. He rode in without hurry, dismounted, and without a word lifted her into his arms. She didn't fight. She barely breathed. His ranch sat high on a bluff east of town, surrounded by rock and silence. Wind moved constantly through the grass, whispering things it couldn't keep. The cabin was small but solid. 1 bedroom, a stove, a table that had seen too many lonely meals. He laid her gently on the cot, brought her water, and cleaned her wounds with a tenderness that felt older than both of them. She spoke first. "What's your name?" she asked through cracked lips. He paused, then simply nodded once toward a carving above the mantel, E. Granger. She looked at him long. Ellis. He didn't answer, but he didn't deny it either. Over the next few days, she healed slowly, watching him move like a ghost through the house. He rose with the sun, tended to his one surviving mule, chopped wood, boiled water, and cleaned his tools with a soldier's discipline. He never spoke, but sometimes, when he thought she wasn't looking, he paused by a small wooden cross in the backfield. Just one, weather-worn and crooked, surrounded by stones and sagebrush. He would stand there with his hat in his hand, the wind tugging at his coat. One morning, as she sat by the stove with a blanket over her knees, she asked him the question no one else had dared. "Why don't you fight back?" He didn't look at her, just kept carving a piece of wood in his hand, shavings falling into a bowl. "You know what they're doing," she continued, voice soft but steady. "To this town, to people like me." He paused then, set the carving down, walked to the door and opened it. Clara followed him outside, barefoot in the dirt. He led her, without a word, to the cross behind the house. The name on the marker was almost gone, worn thin by wind and years, but she could still make it out. Lucy Granger, 1870, 1877. Below it, carved deeper, with shaky hands, *, beloved daughter. May heaven be gentler than earth, *. Clara looked at him, her throat tight. She was 7. Ellis nodded. "What happened?" He stared down at the grave, jaw clenched. Then, in a voice like a dry wind brushing over stone, he spoke for the first time. She was caught in the crossfire, not meant for her. Silence filled the canyon like rising water. "War?" Clara asked, barely above a whisper. He nodded again. "After the war, I tried to stop a raiding party. Missed one shot." Her breath caught. "And your wife?" He closed his eyes. "She died screaming her name." The wind kicked up. A hawk circled above, as if even the sky wanted distance from such pain. He walked away without another word, back to his silence, back to his exile. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She watched him sit by the fire, polishing the rifle he never used, the one with the photograph tucked in its stock. She thought about the girl in the picture, the way her eyes mirrored his. She thought about the sign she'd seen nailed in the square just yesterday. "Anyone found helping the rancher dies next." Brig Cutter. It had been written in blood-red paint, smeared and dripping. The townsfolk had read it and turned away. No one looked toward the hills. No one asked about Clara. She didn't care. In the morning, Ellis found her hanging wet laundry on the line he'd strung between 2 junipers. She looked up at him, the morning sun behind her, hair tangled in the breeze. "I'm not leaving," she said simply. He didn't argue, didn't try to change her mind, just nodded once and helped her hang the next sheet. In the distance, the smoke of another fire rose over the ridge. Closer this time. Ellis watched it burn. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was waiting. The boy's screams echoed through the brittle morning air like nails dragged across a coffin lid. Daniel Boone, barely 20, with soot-streaked arms and a smith's hands too calloused for mercy, was dragged by 2 Cutter boys through the center of Dry Creek. He kicked, spat, and even got one solid headbutt in before the butt of a rifle laid him out cold. They tied him upright to the gallows post in front of the old town hall, roped a thick noose above his head, and left him dangling between heaven and dirt, waiting. Sheriff Wilkes stood just outside his office, leaning hard on a crutch, sweat beading on his brow. His leg was still half rotted from the wound they gave him, and the whiskey he used to dull the pain had turned him soft-eyed and slow. He didn't move when they strung Daniel up, didn't bark or threaten, just watched, jaw clenched, one hand hovering over a pistol he hadn't drawn in weeks. The townsfolk gathered like cattle under thunderclouds, quiet, wide-eyed, and full of the kind of fear that makes bones go cold. Mothers clutched children. Old men held their hats against their chests. Everyone watched as Brig Cutter strutted into the square with the swagger of a showman and the heart of a vulture. Brig was laughing before he even got to the gallows. His long red duster flapped behind him like a devil's tail. He climbed the steps with theatrical flair, drew a revolver, and spun it on his finger. "Ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, "Dry Creek presents the trial of the century." He turned to Daniel, who was awake now, blood dripping from a cut above his eyebrow. "This here is Daniel Boone," Briggs said, loud enough for every corner of the square to hear. "Blacksmith, rebel, and horse thief. Charged with insolence, treason, and the greatest crime of all, believing he could stop the Cutter boys with a hammer and some balls." The crowd didn't laugh. Not one soul smiled. Briggs stepped down and paced before them like a schoolmaster. "See, I told y'all. We own this dirt now. Your sheriff's broken. Your priest ran off. Hell, even your ghost man rancher's too scared to blink in our direction." His eyes landed on Ellis. The rancher stood at the edge of the square, near the edge of shadow, hat low over his brow, hands empty. He watched without expression, the way a man watches a distant fire. No panic, just knowing. Brig pointed at him. "You, the great Ellis Granger, you ever gonna say something? Or are you just gonna let your town die while you polish your rifle and cry over bones?" The silence was complete. It pressed down on every chest like a millstone. Ellis didn't move, didn't flinch. Brig spat and turned his back. "Yeah, that's what I thought." They left Daniel up there with the noose tight and a barrel beneath his feet, promising the execution would happen high noon tomorrow. "We want the sun to see it." Brig grinned. Then the cutter gang rode out, leaving the boy hanging in wait like a warning nailed to a door. That night, the sky turned the color of old bruises, and Dry Creek sat wrapped in quiet, like a town holding its breath. No one dared move Daniel, not even to give him water. It was understood now, the gang's grip was iron, and breaking it came with a rope around your neck. At the ranch on the hill, Ellis stood in the barn long after sunset. A lantern flickered near his boots, casting long shadows that moved like ghosts on the wooden walls. He pulled aside an old horse blanket, kicked dust off a hidden plank, and pried it loose. Beneath, a trunk waited, locked with rust, but not forgotten. He knelt and opened it. The contents had been untouched for years, but time hadn't dulled their shine. Inside lay a long-range Sharp's rifle, oiled and waiting. Next to it, a box of ammunition, each round engraved with a mark only Ellis knew. Beneath that, a small leather-bound journal, pages yellowed and ink faded. He thumbed through a few, paused on a page with blood dried in one corner. Near the bottom of the trunk, wrapped in cloth, was a locket. He opened it. One half held a sketch of a little girl, eyes bright with mischief. The other side, a strand of blonde hair. Clara stood in the doorway, arms folded around herself, like she was trying to hold in everything that wanted to spill out. "You're going," she said softly. Ellis didn't look up. He began cleaning the rifle, checking the scope, oiling the bolt. "They'll kill you." He paused, then turned to her. His voice came low, quiet, steady. "Then it'll be the last thing they ever do." Clara stepped into the light. "You waited all this time. Why now?" He looked at the rifle, then past it, to the edge of the barn, to the open night and the gallows that waited in the heart of town. "Because that boy stood up when no one else did. Because I'm tired of burying good people while the bad ones live fat and drunk on fear." She moved to help without another word, holding bullets as he checked them, handing him a whetstone to sharpen his knife. He glanced at her once. "You don't have to stay." "I know," she said, "but neither do you. And here you are." They worked in silence until the lantern burned low and the night turned still. Before dawn, Ellis stepped outside and looked east. The sky was still dark, but the stars had begun to fade. Clara followed him to the gate. He handed her the locket. "If I don't come back." She stopped him with a hand on his arm. "You will." He nodded once, then turned toward Dry Creek. As he walked, the rifle cradled in his arms, the wind stirred the grass at his feet, whispering through the hills like a prayer that had waited too long to be said. And somewhere ahead, in the heart of a broken town, a noose creaked softly in the early breeze, counting down the hours to noon. The sun sat high and mean over Dry Creek, baking the dust into clay and swallowing every shadow. The gallows stood like a skeleton in the middle of the square, the rope swaying gently in the hot wind. Daniel Boone's face was bloodied and pale, but his chin stayed high, his jaw clenched tight. He'd been up there since morning, his legs trembling, the barrel beneath his feet shifting with every gust. Brig Cutter lounged nearby, boots propped on a crate, chewing a toothpick like he was waiting for a picnic to start. His boys were scattered around the square, laughing, drinking, polishing their weapons in plain sight. One played a harmonica off-key. Another sipped from a bottle and mocked the townsfolk watching from doorways and windows, too afraid to blink. Sheriff Wilkes leaned against the frame of his office, broken but standing, his pistols still holstered. He looked like a man watching his own funeral march, resigned, hollow-eyed, and worn down to splinters. Briggs stood and stretched, grinning wide. He stepped up to the gallows with theatrical flair, pulled the noose tight around Daniel's neck, and patted the boy's cheek. "You got guts, kid," he said, smiling like a wolf. "I like that. Shame we're about to strangle it out of you." Daniel didn't answer. He just stared forward, eyes distant, like he wasn't going to give Brig the pleasure of fear. Brig turned to the crowd, arms wide. "Ladies and gents, Dry Creek's finest comes to a close. Justice, as we define it, is about to be served. Any objections?" No one spoke. No one moved. Far above them, silent as a shadow, Ellis lay prone atop the burned-out roof of the old hotel. His rifle was nestled into the groove between bricks and rotted beams, scope glinting once in the sun before he tucked it back under the brim of his hat. 312 yards. Wind, half a breath from the north. He exhaled slowly, like he was letting go of every grave he'd ever dug. Below, Briggs stepped back, drew his revolver, and raised his arm. "Say goodbye, blacksmith." Then, crack, the rope snapped just above the knot, strands whipping free like a snake losing its skin. Daniel dropped to the ground, hard, gasping as the noose fell limp around his shoulders. Shot cracked across the square like thunder. Cutter boys grabbed for weapons. Someone screamed. Then came the second shot, and the third, and the fourth. 3 bodies hit the ground before the echo faded. One slumped backward over a whiskey barrel, another crumpled near the well, the third never made it to his holster. Blood pooled fast in the dust, dark and sudden. The rest froze, rifles half raised, eyes scanning wildly. Ellis was gone from the rooftop. They didn't see him again until he stepped out from the alley beside the saloon, rifle slung across his back, revolver in hand, eyes hard as iron. His coat flared in the wind, long and black, the dust not daring to cling. Brig turned, mouth open in disbelief. "Well, I'll be." Bang! The gun flew from Briggs' hand, his fingers flaring as it spun away. A second shot took his leg out from under him, and he screamed as he hit the dirt, clutching his thigh. Ellis didn't run. He didn't shout. He walked forward with the slow, deliberate weight of judgment, the kind that didn't need permission. The townsfolk began to scatter, but Clara ran the opposite way, straight for Daniel. She reached him as he staggered up from the ground, half-dazed, and pulled him to safety behind the water trough. His hands were shaking, but he was alive. Brig writhed in the dust, blood leaking through his pants, coughing from the grit kicked up by his own collapse. "You son of a—" Ellis stopped above him, revolver aimed steady, expression unreadable. "Don't," Brig growled. "Don't you dare act like you're better than me. You hid. You let this happen." Ellis stared down at him, the tip of his gun unmoving. "I was hoping the world wouldn't need me again." Brig sneered. "Well, it did." Ellis nodded once, "And now it doesn't." Brig reached slowly for his boot, where another knife gleamed beneath the leather. His hand barely touched it before a bullet shattered the blade, and his fingers along with it. He howled. Ellis holstered the revolver. The silence that followed felt like a closing book, pages fluttering to stillness. The other Cutter boys, those who weren't bleeding out in the street, dropped their weapons one by one. Sheriff Wilkes, with effort, raised his voice for the first time all day. "Put em in the jail. All of em." A few townsfolk stepped forward, cautious but ready. The fear that had strangled them for weeks began to loosen its grip. Ellis turned away. Behind him, Brig whimpered something low and furious. No one listened. Clara stood near the well, one arm around Daniel, her other hand gripping a kitchen knife she'd never had to use. She met Ellis's eyes as he approached. Her lips trembled, not with fear, but with everything she wanted to say and couldn't. He nodded. She stepped aside and let him pass. As he walked back through the square, past the fallen, the blood, the noose lying limp in the dirt, no one stopped him. No one dared. They only watched. Watched the man who had spoken with bullets in memory, who had walked back into hell so no one else would have to. And for the first time in a long time, Dry Creek breathed. The days after the gunfire were quiet, almost too quiet, like the town itself didn't yet believe the nightmare was over. The bodies had been buried, the gallows torn down plank by plank. The last of the Cutter boys who could run had disappeared into the canyons, leaving only their echoes behind. Sheriff Wilkes stood taller now, even with his limp. He offered Ellis a badge, hands trembling as he held it out, a silver star dulled by years and dirt. Ellis looked at it for a long moment, then closed the sheriff's fingers around it and gave a single shake of his head. No words. None needed. By the end of the week, the schoolhouse bell rang again, soft and almost shy. The blacksmith's forge glowed before dawn. Clara dayed, bruises faded and sleeves rolled, hauled water to her small garden, while Daniel Boone hammered nails into her barn wall, building something sturdier than what had stood before. There was life again in Dry Creek. Fragile, flickering, but real. Ellis watched it all from a distance. He mended his own fences in silence, checked the graves out back each morning, leaving a single white stone on the little one. Sometimes, Clara would bring him bread or ask for help with something she didn't need help with. He'd nod, fix whatever needed fixing, then disappear again. One morning, she brought coffee and found the cabin door open. Inside, everything was neatly in place, table wiped clean, cot made tight, rifle gone. On the mantel, beneath the carving that simply read E. Granger, sat the locket. She picked it up gently, her fingers trembling as it clicked open. Inside, the girl sketch still smiled with those same curious eyes, and the lock of hair still shimmered pale gold. Tucked beneath the locket was a small leather journal, worn and soft. She sat down and began to read. The words inside were sparse, but heavy. They spoke of a man raised hard, who went to war too young, came back with blood on his hands and ghosts in his lungs. They told of a family found late, loved deeply, and lost violently, of the one shot he didn't take that cost him everything. A vow followed. Silence. Exile. A life buried under dust and cattle and the whispering wind. But near the end, the handwriting steadied. One boy stood when the rest turned away. One woman stayed when everyone else fled. Sometimes the world still has teeth, but sometimes it remembers how to bite back. I'm not the man they needed. I'm the man they had left. That was enough. Clara pressed the journal to her chest and closed her eyes. For the first time since the fire had taken her home, she wept. Not from fear, not even from grief, just for the weight of it all. That morning, just before sunrise, someone saw a lone rider cresting the ridge east of town. A black coat, a slow gait, no saddlebag, no supplies. Just a man and his horse moving into the morning like they'd always been part of it. No one called out. No one chased. Ellis never looked back. The sky turned gold behind him, and the wind picked up, tugging gently at the dust he left behind. And Dry Creek, still bruised but breathing, watched its quietest legend disappear into the light. They laughed at the silent rancher, until he spoke with thunder, and left with the wind.